At 05:12 local time, something shifted, but not on the battlefield. No explosions, no missile launches, no dramatic footage. Instead, the center of gravity quietly moved to something far less visible and far more decisive: money, energy, and time. For weeks, the conflict had followed a familiar pattern. Iran applied pressure through drones, maritime harassment, and asymmetric tactics across the Strait of Hormuz. The United States and its allies responded by degrading launch sites, tracking mobile units, and intercepting threats as they appeared. On the surface, it looked like a conventional cycle of action and reaction. But inside command centers, a different conclusion was forming. Destroying launchers wasn't enough. Intercepting drones wasn't enough. Even hitting isolated bases wasn't enough. Because as long as Iran could produce, fund, and sustain those operations, the pressure would never truly stop. So the objective changed. Instead of focusing on what Iran was using, the focus shifted to how Iran kept the system alive in the first place. That meant energy, oil exports, gas processing, refining capacity, power stability, the entire network that allowed Iran to finance operations, maintain logistics, and absorb losses over time. This wasn't about a dramatic strike. It was about something colder, a calculated effort to slow the engine of war itself. And once that shift happened, the timeline of the conflict began to compress. Because wars aren't only decided by who fires more weapons, they're decided by who can afford to keep fighting. And at that moment, the United States wasn't just looking at the battlefield anymore. It was looking at the system behind it. At 05:28, the map stopped being a collection of targets and became a network. What analysts inside U.S. Command quickly understood was this: Iran's strength didn't come from any single facility. It came from how everything was connected. Refineries fed export terminals. Gas processing plants supported power generation. Electrical nodes sustained industrial output. Logistics routes tied it all together. On paper, it was a resilient system, built to survive isolated strikes. Take out one facility, and another compensates. Damage a port, and exports shift elsewhere. Disrupt a node, and the network reroutes. That was the theory. But that theory had a weakness. It only worked if the damage stayed fragmented. So instead of hitting the biggest targets, the U.S. and its partners began focusing on something far more precise: the connectors, processing hubs, electrical substations, pipeline junctions, export bottlenecks. Not the most visible targets, but the ones that kept everything moving. And when those points were hit, carefully, selectively, the effect didn't show up as a massive explosion. It showed up as friction. A refinery that couldn't operate at full capacity, a shipment delayed by hours, then days, a power fluctuation that forced systems offline. Individually, each disruption looked manageable. Together, they began to stack. And that stacking effect is where the strategy revealed itself. Because this wasn't designed to collapse Iran overnight. It was designed to stretch its system beyond what it could comfortably sustain. At the same time, something else started to happen. Global markets reacted. Shipping slowed. Insurance risks increased, oil prices began to fluctuate, and in a place like the Strait of Hormuz, perception isn't a side effect, it's a force multiplier. You don't have to shut the strait down completely, you just have to make the world believe that it might. And as that belief spread, Iran found itself facing a new kind of pressure, not just from airstrikes or naval presence, but from the growing cost of keeping its own strategy alive. At 05:46, the effects were no longer confined to charts, reports, or satellite imagery. They began to show up where it matters most, on the battlefield itself. Because when resources tighten, war doesn't stop. It changes its rhythm. In the early phase, Iran's approach relied on volume and persistence. Swarms of drones, repeated maritime pressure, multiple points of tension operating at once. It was a way to offset technological disadvantages by forcing constant reaction. But that model came with a hidden cost. It depended on continuous output, production, logistics, and funding working without interruption. And now, those systems were under strain. Energy disruptions meant less industrial stability. Power inconsistencies slowed manufacturing cycles. Logistical friction reduced the speed at which assets could be moved, repaired, or replaced. None of it caused an immediate collapse. But it didn't have to, because what started to emerge was something far more subtle and far more dangerous: inconsistency. Some units responded slower than before. Others operated more cautiously, spacing out their movements. Drone launches still happened, but less frequently, less densely. The pressure was still there, but it no longer felt synchronized. And in modern conflict, synchronization is everything. A fragmented system doesn't just lose efficiency, it loses momentum. That's where the opportunity opened. The United States and its allies didn't need to eliminate Iran's capabilities outright. They only needed to slow them down enough to regain the initiative. And that shift, even if it looks small, can redefine an entire operation. Because once one side controls the tempo, the other is forced to react. Iran still had tools, drones, missiles, asymmetric tactics, but each one was becoming harder to sustain at the same intensity. And when a strategy depends on constant pressure, even a slight disruption can start a chain reaction. At that point, the conflict stopped being about isolated strikes. It became a question of endurance. Who could maintain operational tempo longer, and who would begin to slip first? At 06:12, the shift became harder to ignore. What had started as economic pressure was now shaping tactical decisions in real time. And that's where things begin to get dangerous. Because when a force starts losing operational margin, it faces a choice: slow down or take on more risk to compensate. In this case, the signs pointed in one direction. Iran wasn't stepping back. It was pushing forward, faster, and with less room for error. At sea, that meant more aggressive movements, fast attack boats closing distance quicker than before, tighter formations, shorter windows between actions. It was an attempt to maintain pressure in the Strait of Hormuz. But aggression comes with a trade-off. The closer you move, the more you expose. On land, the pattern was similar. Mobile missile launchers had less time to reposition. Logistics cycles were compressed. Concealment became harder to maintain under constant surveillance. Each decision made sense in isolation, but taken together, they pointed to something else: a system operating under stress. And stress changes behavior. Movements become more predictable. Preparation windows shrink. Margins for error disappear. That's the contradiction at the heart of this phase. To sustain pressure, Iran needed to act. But by acting faster, it was beginning to reveal more. And in a battle space where every movement is tracked by satellites, airborne radar, and electronic intelligence, that kind of exposure doesn't go unnoticed. The United States and its partners didn't need to force a mistake. They just needed to wait until the pressure did it for them. Because once a system begins to rush, it starts to show patterns. And patterns are what turn uncertainty into opportunity. By this point, the question wasn't whether something would go wrong. It was when, at 06:37, the pressure finally produced what planners had been anticipating all along. Not a collapse, not a retreat, but something far more useful: a visible reaction. From Iran's perspective, it made sense. Energy pressure was building. Operational tempo was slipping. International perception was beginning to shift. Doing nothing was no longer an option. To maintain credibility and deterrence, Tehran needed to show it could still escalate. So it did. Fast attack boats surged forward in tighter formations. Drone launches increased within shorter time windows. Missile units operated with reduced concealment and faster reposition cycles. Individually, none of these moves were reckless. Together, they created something different: clarity. For the first time in the operation, Iranian activity began to form recognizable patterns. Routes repeated, timings aligned. Deployment rhythms became more consistent, not by design, but by necessity. And that was the mistake, because on the other side, those patterns weren't just observed, they were mapped. Surveillance systems, airborne early warning, ISR platforms, and signals intelligence began connecting those movements into a coherent picture, not isolated events, but a system revealing how it operated under pressure. And once that picture came together, the dynamic shifted instantly. This was no longer about reacting to individual threats. It became about anticipating them before they unfolded. A drone launch wasn't just intercepted, it was expected. A naval maneuver wasn't just tracked, it was pre-positioned against. A missile deployment didn't create surprise, it confirmed a pattern. What was meant to reassert pressure ended up exposing structure. And in modern warfare, structure is vulnerability, because once your system can be read, it can be disrupted. Not just once, but repeatedly. That's when Iran began to lose something more important than territory or assets. It began to lose initiative. At 07:08, the shift was no longer subtle. What had once been pressure was now predictability. And in a battle space where every movement is monitored, analyzed, and cross-referenced across multiple intelligence layers, predictability can be more damaging than losing a single position. Up to this point, Iran's strategy had worked because it forced uncertainty, dispersed attacks, irregular timing, Flexible deployment. It created friction. It slowed decision-making on the other side. But under sustained pressure, that flexibility began to narrow. Certain routes were used more frequently. Drone launches appeared in similar time windows. Naval movements followed increasingly familiar patterns. None of it looked like a mistake on its own, but together, it was enough. Because this is exactly what U.S. forces needed. Instead of reacting to each individual threat, they began identifying rhythms, not just where Iran was operating, but how, and more importantly, when. And once that happens, the entire equation changes. Now, it's not about who fires first. It's about who knows where to look before anything even begins. From that point forward, U.S. responses became more selective, more efficient, less reactive. Naval units adjusted positions ahead of expected movements. Surveillance assets focused on known corridors. Interceptions happened earlier, sometimes before threats fully developed. Each action wasn't just neutralizing a target. It was disrupting Iran's ability to repeat the same pattern again. And that's the key, because when a strategy depends on consistency, and that consistency is broken, the system begins to unravel. Iran still had tools, but now, every attempt to apply pressure risked being anticipated and countered before it had impact. This wasn't a dramatic victory, but it was something more decisive. The moment when control of the tempo quietly changed hands. At 08:10, the most important outcome wasn't measured in destroyed targets. It was measured in perception. For years, Iran's strategy in the Strait of Hormuz had relied on a simple but powerful idea. It didn't need full control of the waterway to influence it. It only needed to maintain a constant, credible threat, enough to create uncertainty for every ship passing through. That uncertainty was its leverage. And for a long time, it worked. But over the course of these hours, something shifted. That perception didn't disappear, but it weakened. Iran still had missiles, still had drones, still had asymmetric tools. But the operation revealed something critical. The system behind those tools could be disrupted, slowed, and under enough pressure, understood. And once a system can be understood, it can be controlled. This is where the real outcome takes shape. The United States didn't need a dramatic, decisive victory. It didn't need to eliminate every threat. What it achieved instead was more subtle and arguably more powerful. It changed the conditions of the fight. It showed that pressure could be applied not just to targets, but to the structure that supports them. That tempo could be controlled. That patterns could be identified and exploited. And in doing so, it shifted the balance from reacting to anticipating. For global markets and shipping routes, the message was clear. The Strait of Hormuz remains dangerous, but it is no longer a space defined by one-sided uncertainty. Because in modern conflict, victory isn't always about overwhelming force. Sometimes, it's about changing the rules without needing to break everything. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to check out our next analysis. Stay informed, because in conflicts like this, everything can change in a matter of hours.